But this is enough introduction. I'm asking you to speak about the subject, reflections on future political crisis, plural, and today's policies. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Busek, for the introduction, and thank you to everybody for having invited me to this meeting. This is my second time. Last year I was in Skopje, and we had a very interesting discussion, which gave me a great deal of food for thought. I'm looking towards a discussion today also. I'm grateful to Boris Bergan for having renewed his initiative for me to come to your meeting, and also for the suggestion, which I understand has been given a great deal of support, to have another meeting next year in connection with the Brest Strategic Forum, which is a traditional, not very old, but already a traditional gathering, which brings together a fairly interesting collection of policymakers, journalists, thinkers, doers, and everybody else. So it's a good environment to have a serious discussion about the media aspect of various questions that are on the agenda of the forum, and also the importance of the element of communication in handling these different international issues that are being discussed. So I think this looks like a very natural synergy, and I would very much like that to happen next year. Now, this year I was asked to give a short introduction, and then we would have a discussion. I don't intend to give a long speech or anything, but rather in short introduction. I think according to the program we have like 45 minutes time for the whole thing, and if I say something in the first 10-15 minutes, that would give us a lot of time for your comments and questions, for which I'm really interested. And I'm saying so because I have been recently involved in a number of discussions on various international issues. I was in Washington earlier this week. I came back to Ljubljana yesterday. I'm going to Shanghai next week, discussing various international crisis situations. And when I was thinking, what should I say by way of introduction this year, which would be sufficiently different from what I said last year, for those of you who may remember what we discussed, but still be a kind of a continuity, a step forward, I found out that the answer to this question is really not very difficult. When I was in Washington, I was, of course, reading Washington Post on a daily basis, and one of the main and most disturbing pictures on the front page of Washington Post some 3 days ago was not from Syria or from, I don't know, South China Sea or from any other visitor of headlines, but from Šentil on the border between Slovenia and Austria, a refugee situation which looked really dramatic and disturbing. And of course, you don't find pictures from this part of Europe, especially not from Slovenian and Austrian border, on the front page of the Washington Post very often. But this tells us something about the perception of crisis globally today. The refugee crisis in Europe is understood as a major, perhaps the most pressing crisis situation in the world today. In par with Syria, much before Ukraine, for example. That's an interesting perceptual matter. I discussed this with people in Brookings Institution, where I have a kind of an open-ended agenda, and we spend most of the time on refugee issues in Europe today, in Atlantic Council in Washington, and everywhere this was kind of in the forefront. Although we are not talking about violence, we are not talking about wars, but we are talking about something that is perceived as significant in terms of transformation of relations, transformation of situation in Europe. And of course that causes a great deal of concern and a great deal of question. So I decided that I would say a few words by way of introduction on the crisis, refugee crisis in Europe today as a symptom of a larger malaise. And of course hope to open a discussion which would then deal with other questions as well. Now of course the title of my talk, which was given on the program, is not without an element of irony, reflections on future political crises, as if we didn't have enough of them already, or today's policies, as if we were trying to just a little bit adjust today's policies in order to avoid tomorrow's crisis. Now, of course, we don't have this sort of privileged situation. We have to deal with an acute crisis in Europe, and we have to think about action that has to be rather quick and perhaps transformative. And of course, in this kind of situations, it is important to have quality media available, quality reporting, quality commentary. It's a very important part of the overall situation. Last year, I started my talk in Skopje with a quote from Ban Ki-moon, who, Secretary General of the United Nations, who said at the opening of the General Assembly, and I quote, "It may seem that the world is falling apart as crises pile." That are words of the Secretary General. The Secretary General of the UN is not expected to talk about how the world is falling apart. The Secretary General should be like a head nurse in a hospital who has to be there to help and figure out what to do, not to tell people how the situation is terrible. But that probably is the situation which requires a good and accurate diagnosis. Now, I think that several points which I would like to propose for your reflection, your comment in our discussion on this. I think that in the past decade or so, we have seen a tendency in politics, in the most important powers of the world, most important power centers of the world, which has strengthened and deepened the identity aspect and emotional aspect of politics, as opposed to rational and argument-based politics. We have seen this happening everywhere. We have seen this in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, most dramatically. But we are seeing this drift, this change increasingly in Europe as well. And we are seeing it obviously in the United States, in the presidential campaign. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is a homogeneous movement, but there is a tendency which one should not overlook, and I think one should criticize, because identity politics generally leads to problems, and we have seen this in our part of Europe a lot in the past 2 to 3 decades, how identity politics in former Yugoslavia has brought a war and created problems which could be avoided. So identity politics and emotion-based politics is gaining globally. Now, this brings me to the question of refugees and the European Union. In Europe nowadays, we also see a rising tide of emotional identity-based argument, which is generally transformed in broader public support for what we call the right spectrum of politics, and is at the detriment of a more rational and practical discussion which we are lacking. And of course, we can look at the problems of refugees in various ways. We have to recognize, and that this is my second point for your consideration, that Europe has not dealt with its demographic situation seriously for a long time now. If you read the reports and speeches by the International Organization on Migrations, which is based in Geneva but not part of the UN system, William Swing, the director of that agency, constantly warned that in Europe we shall need by 2030 about 25 million additional people on the labor market. A huge problem emerging. Not too distant future, 15 years, that's not all that much. We have also avoided a serious discussion about a very inadequate visa policy that the European Union has been pursuing for a long time now in the Balkans, vis-à-vis Ukraine, Russia, Caucasus, Turkey, and other countries in the immediate neighborhood. We didn't have, the European Union was not able to develop a visa policy which would in any way be related to the population problems that it fundamentally has. International migrations were often perceived as a threat, not as a phenomenon which can and should be managed, and led towards solution of this fundamental demographic problem that the European Union has. And we have seen these discussions everywhere, and including in the United Kingdom, where, for example, David Cameron has actually gained a great deal before the latest election from his argument that in internal migrations within the European Union represent a growing problem for Britain, and therefore something should be done about that. So we have seen again a version of identity politics, emotion-based politics, and a threat, and migrations described as a threat, which of course made the whole discussion, which was very much necessary, impossible. And now if we go from this kind of a fundamental picture to more specific questions of the refugee crisis today, we see that the European Union in the last 5 years was unable to develop any proper response to the refugee crisis. I was still president in 2011 when we had a meeting of a group of presidents of European Union countries, which is called Arraiolos Group. This is named after a place in Portugal where presidents without executive powers first time met. I mean, presidents of Italy, Germany, Hungary, and I don't know which other. Slovenia came later, Poland also joined, and so forth. So this is a group which is a good reflection group. And I was surprised when the press conference that was held in Budapest in April 2011 addressed the question of refugees, which was affecting Italy at that time, but had very little understanding anywhere else in Europe. It looked like a very ominous discussion which showed that Italy has to handle this situation alone, and that there is very little common energy in the European Union to address this as a problem that the European Union should be dealing with at the level of the Union. So we have had that inadequate political understanding. We have been, of course, completely kind of dominated by rules of Schengen and Dublin, which were designed to deal with individual crossings of border by individual people, not a massive refugee flow, not an exodus type of situation. And of course that has remained until very late, and as far as I understand it, is still dominant in the European Union decision making. And then we have seen also another phenomenon which is really very disturbing in this context, and that is the weakening role of the European Commission. The European Commission has produced several proposals on how to deal with this problem, but these were largely ignored, and the whole thing became visible only through such things like statements for preservation of Schengen system, and later on the idea of quotas, which I think was very misguided and came at the wrong moment. One cannot deal with this problem by starting with quotas. One can perhaps add the idea of quotas later on when you have already a degree of common policy. You can't leave the whole thing to the frontline states and then say, okay, we'll have quotas. That creates a wrong psychology, wrong political dynamic, and now, of course, we don't know how this whole thing will end up. Now, this is where I see the problems, and that I would also like to suggest to you for your comments, because I think we need this discussion, and we need really deeper quality discussion in Europe on all these questions. Now, of course, you may ask me, well, what is the way forward? What should be the steps forward? I think that there are three things needed in European Union if we want to preserve the Union for the future. First, we need, of course, a much stronger common capacity for border management. I think up to 1,500, 2,000 officials, European Union officials, who would actually be in the areas where migration is more intense, and who will be there to handle all kinds of procedures that are necessary. But of course, that may take time to construct, and this is something that obviously may not be seen as the immediate priority in the face in the face of an acute crisis. On the other hand, I think we need much more investment in the whole management of migration flows. I have seen some economists suggesting that there should be like 20 billion euro annually devoted to management of these processes and everything that goes with acceptance and handling of the immediate situation, as well as leading the whole process towards integration of these people. And above all, and I think we need in Europe a new discussion on visa policy. The visa policy has been clearly inadequate, and this has to be recognized quite plainly. The natural demographic background of Europe in places like the Balkans, like Ukraine, like Russia and others, has been excluded from more normal communication, and that creates a problem. So I think visa policy has to be reviewed and a new type of policy established. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that this is a definitive answer, but what I'm saying, these are the kind of questions we need to address. Better border management, much more investment from the EU into the management of migrations, and a change in visa policy. All of this is open for discussion, and I would be very interested in your comments on it. But then I think we also have to think about something else, and that is how has this latest crisis affected the European Union structures more generally, and how do these problems fit in the larger picture of the European Union, where I think the situation is really quite disturbing. We are witnessing a collapse of an important part of the EU system, and an inability of EU to respond to the crisis. Now, we have seen the financial crisis since 2010, and the response, which was less than optimal, to put it mildly. We see one very disturbing phenomenon in this context, which of course was very visible in the refugee crisis, but was also visible already at the time of financial crisis, the decline of what we call the community method. Community method, as it was conceived and practiced in the past, required a leading role for the European Commission. Now, we have seen a gradual decline of power of the European Commission, irrespective of all these political discussions which have characterized the formation of the current Commission. So it's a big discrepancy between political expectations expressed in the elections last year and the actual situation in the functioning of the European Union, and that is, I think, very disturbing. Then, obviously, we have to look things even in a larger context. Let us think about the current developments in the context of the decade between 2005 and 2015. In 2005, we will all recall the European Constitution was proposed and defeated in a referendum in France and the Netherlands, two core countries of the European Union. That's where the problem is, in the core countries of the European Union. So the EU Constitution was defeated, and what happened afterwards was creation of a treaty which is known as Lisbon Treaty in 2009. Now, that Lisbon Treaty was described to me by a senior European political personality as a bureaucratic camouflage of the Constitution. I don't think that description is accurate. What actually happened was something else, something that we know in political theory as flight from politics into the world of norms, flight from actual political decision-making into a kind of a normative illusion. I think Carl Schmitt was the German political theorist and legal theorist who described this phenomenon with some persuasiveness. I think we have seen a variant of that in the European Union in the last 10 years. We started to believe that norms will somehow change the situation without having the necessary energetic political input. And again, I can mention one of my experiences from the time when I was president. We had a press conference in Prague with President Václav Klaus after a discussion where we talked about, of course, about the Lisbon Treaty. He was very critical. I was very supportive. Slovenia was presiding at the time of the ratification process, and we, of course, were campaigning for the ratification of the Lisbon Treaty. Now, one of the journalists asked President Klaus whether we talked about Lisbon Treaty, and he said, kind of condescendingly, not at all. We didn't have time. We didn't want to waste our time on something as insignificant as the Lisbon Treaty. I'm mentioning this small anecdote simply to say that there has always been a doubt there. And now, after we have witnessed two crisis situations, one on finance, the other on refugees, where the treaty and its legal framework does not really help, we have rethinked the whole situation very seriously. Now, this leads me to my final point on Europe, where the future lies. I think that in these circumstances, actually, the European Union needs a very serious policy discussion. It needs something that is actually being proposed by David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, perhaps for reasons which are not his. And you know, in politics, sometimes right things happen for wrong reasons. And if this is the case, then it is actually good. Right things happen for wrong reasons. Of course, the best is if right things happen for right reasons. But you know, you don't always have this sort of luxury, so you have to settle for accepting the discussion on the right things for wrong reasons. Now, as I understand, the Cameron or the British idea is to put in the center of discussion two core concepts. One is sovereignty of member states, and the other is fairness within the European Union. I think this is a very valid proposition, irrespective of the original motivations. I think the European Union needs this sort of discussion now and needs a kind of policy reorientation, adjustment, of course. I would not say immediate institutional changes, but certainly adjustments are needed. Now, I don't want to paint a picture which is only bleak and pessimistic. I just wanted to conclude my remarks by referring to something that is actually a positive development, albeit not a deliberate one. We have seen in the negotiations on the Iranian nuclear program, the European Union playing a role which was higher than expected. It was not a decisive role, but it was a significant role, something that the European Union does not play always. It was a significant role. It started at the time of the previous High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, Lady Ashton, and was continued ably by Federica Mogherini. But you see, what is interesting in that context is how the European Union was represented in those talks. It was 5 permanent members of the Security Council, which means from Europe, France, and the United Kingdom. It was Germany because its special role in this context, and it was the European Union, the foreign policy chief, who happens to be an Italian. So we got, you know, a good sample of countries of the European Union who could credibly play a role for the European Union. And I think that this format is actually something valuable that has to be preserved for the future, that has to be maintained for Syria, and we have seen in Vienna talks about a week ago that did happen. And I hope it will continue to be the case, and that it will spread, that it will also be available for Middle East more broadly, for Palestinian issue when the time comes, and so forth. Now, I do not want to deal with other crises right now because I have spent already very much more than I thought on something that I believe is quite topical today. But I would like to conclude by saying, look, whichever crisis you take, you come to a point at which you conclude that we need more than ever before quality reporting, quality commentary, and an innovative interplay between what is happening in the social media and then what's happening in the classical media, if I may put it this way. Therefore, you are on the front lines right now. And of course, hearing from the front lines is always interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.